When the last shots of World War II fell silent, the world breathed a collective sigh of relief. But as the ashes settled, a new, colder conflict began to crystallize. This wasn't a war of roaring tanks and invading armies, but one of silent threats, shadowy espionage, and the terrifying possibility of mutual annihilation. The Cold War, which stretched from 1947 to 1991, grew directly from the unresolved tensions of World War II, turning wartime allies into bitter enemies. The cheers of victory faded, replaced by the ominous hum of nuclear test sites. The United States and the Soviet Union, once partners in defeating fascism, were now locked in a global chess match. While World War II was a hot war, a brutal inferno of direct combat that claimed over 70 million lives, the Cold War was different. It remained cold because the superpowers never directly clashed on the battlefield. Yet, it mirrored the dynamics of its predecessor in almost every way, from clashing ideologies to the drawing of new world maps and the relentless buildup of military might. Let's explore these haunting parallels where pride, underestimation, and ignored warnings pushed humanity right back to the brink. At its heart, World War II was a fight between worldviews, liberal democracies and their communist ally, against the totalitarian regimes of fascism. The Cold War simply reprised this ideological drama, swapping out fascism for communism as the West's primary adversary. The United States, championing capitalism and individual freedom, saw Soviet expansionism as a new brand of imperialism, eerily similar to Nazi Germany's quest for Lebensraum or living space. On the other side, the Soviet Union, scarred by the loss of 27 million people in World War II and a long history of invasions, viewed Western capitalism as a hostile encirclement. This deep-seated paranoia, rooted in the revolution and amplified by Stalin's brutal purges, framed their entire foreign policy. Propaganda machines, which had worked overtime during World War II, were fired up once again, just as Axis Radio demonized the Allies. Cold War broadcasts like Voice of America and Radio Moscow battled for the world's hearts and minds, each side painting the other as an existential threat. This wasn't just a war of words, it had real-world consequences. In both conflicts, ideology was used to justify military intervention. During World War II, it was the liberation of Europe from fascism. During the Cold War, it was the domino theory, the fear that if one nation fell to communism, its neighbors would inevitably follow. This fear drove American involvement in places like Vietnam, just as the failure to stand up to Hitler's initial aggressions had led to a wider war. The result was a world starkly divided, where concepts like freedom and equality became powerful weapons. In a global struggle for dominance, the geopolitical landscape of the Cold War was drawn at the very conferences that ended World War II. At Yalta and Potsdam, the victorious Allies carved up the post-war world, but in doing so, they planted the seeds of future conflict, much like the Treaty of Versailles had inadvertently set the stage for World War II by punishing Germany so harshly. The division of Germany into 4 occupation zones wasn't meant to be permanent, but it soon solidified. The erection of the Berlin Wall in 1961 became the ultimate symbol of this new division, a concrete manifestation of a fractured continent. Winston Churchill, who had warned the world about Hitler for years, once again sounded the alarm. In his famous 1946 speech, he declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. Behind it, the Soviet Union was installing puppet governments in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia through rigged elections and political coups. Economically, the battle lines were just as clear. The United States launched the Marshall Plan, a massive aid package designed to rebuild Western Europe and, crucially, to prevent the spread of communism by addressing the poverty and despair it fed on. This was a strategic move, much like the Lend-Lease program that had supplied Allied nations with vital war materials. During World War II, the Soviets responded with their own economic bloc, Comecon, which bound Eastern European economies to Moscow, creating a system of dependency that mirrored Japan's so-called co-prosperity sphere in Asia. This global rivalry didn't just play out in Europe. It spilled over into what became known as proxy wars. The Korean War began in 1950 after the country was arbitrarily divided along the 38th parallel, a line on a map that became a bloody front line. The war tested America's new policy of containment and cost millions of lives. Later, conflicts in Vietnam, interventions in Latin America, and power struggles across newly decolonized Africa became the battlegrounds. The superpowers armed and advised opposing sides, avoiding a direct fight, but fueling devastating wars that inflicted World War II-level destruction. On a local scale, militarily, the Cold War was defined by a terrifying escalation of the technological race that began in World War II. The evolution from tanks and bombers to intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, changed the very nature of warfare. The Manhattan Project, which produced the atomic bombs that ended the war in the Pacific, also ushered in the age of nuclear terror. For a few years, the United States held a monopoly on the bomb, but when the Soviets successfully tested their own in 1949, the doctrine of mutual assured destruction, or MAD, was born. This horrifying logic dictated that a nuclear attack by one superpower would be met with an overwhelming counterattack from the other, resulting in the complete annihilation of both. The constant threat of instant obliteration hung over the world for decades. Military alliances formalized this global divide. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was formed in 1949 as a defensive pact for the Western powers, a clear successor to the Grand Alliance of World War II. The Soviet Union responded by creating the Warsaw Pact in 1955, uniting the Eastern Bloc nations under its military command, much like the Axis powers had aligned. These alliances were meant to provide security, but they also heightened the fear of a preemptive strike, creating a hair-trigger atmosphere. Espionage, a dark art perfected during World War II with code-breaking efforts like Enigma, reached new heights of intensity. The Cold War was an era of spies and counter-spies, of defectors and double agents. High-profile cases, like the trial of the Rosenbergs for passing atomic secrets to the Soviets, exposed the deep-seated mistrust that poisoned relations. This suspicion was fueled by unresolved wounds from the war itself, such as the Katyn massacre, where Soviet forces had executed thousands of Polish officers, a crime they denied for 50 years. Moments of high tension, like the 1948 Berlin blockade, brought the world to the edge. When the Soviets cut off all land and water access to West Berlin, the Allies responded with a massive airlift, flying in supplies for nearly a year. It was a test of will that echoed the great sieges of World War II, like the Siege of Leningrad, but this time, the conflict was resolved without a full-scale war. Even the space race, a seemingly peaceful competition, had military undertones. The same Vita rockets that Germany had used to terrorize London became the basis for both American and Soviet missile programs. When Neil Armstrong took his first step on the moon, it was not just a giant leap for mankind, but also a decisive victory for the U.S. in this technological and ideological showdown. Ultimately, just like World War II, the Cold War was a contest of industrial and economic might. America's post-war economic boom allowed it to fund a massive military buildup and project its power globally, reprising its role as the arsenal of democracy. But the parallels also reveal a tragic failure. The victors of World War II, instead of building a foundation for lasting peace, simply replicated the divisions and rivalries of the past, but now with nuclear weapons in the mix. Hubris played a major role. Stalin dismissed Western concerns and offers of cooperation, just as Western leaders had initially underestimated Hitler's ambitions. This cycle of mistrust and miscalculation led to decades of tension that nearly boiled over into nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The Cold War finally ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Unlike the messy aftermath of World War II, this ending offered a moment of redemption, a chance to build a new world order. For a time, it seemed a new era of cooperation had dawned.